for the rumbling. Many different ways to try and see conflict as something to be resolved. That's normally the general framing, how conflict at the university has been approached. One way to resolve conflict is to try and remove it by asserting some sort of dominant ideal that reaffirms the purpose of the university, whether this is a broadly humanistic ideal or a civic ideal or a functional economic ideal. People will try and say, this is what the university is about, and we need to rediscover the sense of purpose, and that will help reorganize our activities in such a way that conflict will go away because we'll be on the same page. We'll have a new sense of mission. So that's one kind of strategy that I'll be discussing. The other is to try and remove conflict by, in essence, tightening state controls, setting up a rational structure in such a way that allows the sort of sprawling, conflict-ridden environment to be brought under control and managed. So I'm going to try and sketch a position that is between these two strategies and argue, in essence, that they're both ineffective in their own ways, and maybe there's a third strategy that could see conflict not as something to be resolved, but rather as something to be harnessed, and maybe something that might even be constitutive of the university functioning and reproducing itself over time. So that's just to preview the argument. Okay, so the first figure, Honora O'Neill, who we saw a moment before, she's a British philosopher. She's also a politician. At this point, she's no longer in the university. She's in the House of Lords, but she's a very famous Kantian scholar. And in 2002, she was asked to give a set of lectures called the Reith Lectures. And these are normally published as a book, and they're, a famous philosopher gets to speak on some matter of great public importance. And she chose the issue of trust as her topic. In the book, in the lectures, she explores the lack of trust in modern life, explores ways that trust has been eroded, why this might be something to lament. And while she doesn't speak of the university directly, we can see the university as being sort of part of this general discourse or this general cultural condition of a lack of trust. One way we can see this is the imposition of controls on the research function of universities that first were called the research assessment exercise and later turned into what is now called the research excellence framework. And these are a set of quantified targets that researchers have to meet. And if they don't meet them, they lose funding, they don't get promoted in their jobs. So it was a way to kind of rationalize the research exercise, quantify it, measure it, in theory, optimize it. And this was a way to rein academics in and make sure that their research was being disciplined by some sort of external measure of productivity, whether that's measured in terms of being productive in making the economy run more smoothly, or any number of ways one could measure things as being productive. Nevertheless, these research targets were being set. And what this implied was that academics were no longer seen as trustworthy in organizing their own research activities. Therefore, they needed some kind of external targets, measures, and management in order to be productive. They couldn't organize these activities on their own. Now, the ends of the research excellence framework, much like the ends of a lot of higher education policy today, are often expressed in terms of economic productivity. So higher education is an important sector in terms of raising the economic productivity of the nation. And in order to do this, one needs market mechanisms, one needs managerial structures, one needs things that will discipline higher education in a way that it can be a contributor to economic activity. Now, this has been described by many people as being consonant with neoliberalism, whatever term we want to use. A term that I'll be using is to think about this in terms of the post-welfare state university. So the university now is no longer about universal programs and access. It's no longer given broad leeway to organize its own activities as it was in the post-war period. But now, like many areas of public life, it is disciplined towards the ends that are substantially set by market mechanisms or by a state that no longer assumes the responsibility for providing provisions, but rather distributes those broadly amongst the populations, puts them onto individuals, and universities are meant to allow individuals to assume those responsibilities that the state once held. So this, a scholar of higher education in the US, Jeffrey J. Williams, calls the post-welfare state university. And like O'Neill's discussion of trust, this is sort of premised on the idea that universities can't be left to organize their own activities. Rather, they need to be disciplined in some way in order to actively contribute to this new model of the state that they're involved in. And this has all kinds of material effects. Speaking of the US, we can see the rapid growth in administrators relative to faculty. So people who are managing this new vision of the university. It's led to this big growth in administrators. And also it's led to the faculty itself changing, where you have a lot more people on part-time contracts and a lot less people who are full-time tenure track faculty who are organizing the activities of the university. So this allows it to be disciplined in such a way that it can productively contribute to the economic goals of the post-welfare state university. So here we have a great example of the university being defined by conflict, this conflict being seen as an impediment to it achieving its purpose. The purpose is now described in terms of contributing to these broad economic goals that are set by the post-welfare state university. And the material consequence is the recomposition of the faculty to make it more contingent and pliable in terms of what these managers require of it, and in terms of the administration taking on more of a role in governance, whereas faculty self-governance was once an ideal of the university. Okay, so this is where I want to discuss Kant in his book, The Conflict of the Faculties, because Kant is a figure that is interesting in these times that we live in, because he is someone who sees conflict not as something that needs to be managed or something that needs to be resisted by reasserting some humanistic ideal, for example, but rather he sees conflict as constitutive of the university, and moreover, conflict helps articulate a vision of the university that is at the sort of dynamic interface between the goals of the state and the goods that are internal to learning and research that occur at the modern university. And so the university, in a sense, becomes a site whereby we can clarify a lot of issues that are involved in these broad transformations of state purpose, and whereby the university can have some sort of productive role in that clarification and maybe in some sort of normative reconstruction of both the state and the university at the same time. So Kant, on the one hand, takes a very traditional view of the university. He adopts the medieval structure that's been around since Bologna, which has the higher faculties of law, theology, and medicine, and the lower faculty of philosophy, which would include the social sciences and history and things like that, even the natural sciences. So Kant accepts the structure and thinks the structure serves the university well, and more importantly, it serves the state very well. So he's speaking at the end of the 19th century, but he sees the university as being important for the state to realize a series of ends that it should take seriously. So theology, he describes as speaking to the external well-being and the inner life of citizens. The state has an interest in both of these things, and through the faculty of theology, through the training of religious leaders who can then disseminate essentially approved versions of Protestantism or whatever, can attend to this state goal. The law, which is involved with the civic and social order of society, again, is something that the state is interested in, and the legal faculty is responsible for, leading this kind of effort, training lawyers, jurists, that kind of thing. And moreover, the medicine has to do, in Kant's terms, with the maintenance of a strong reproductive population. Therefore, the medical faculty is involved with making sure that medical knowledge is contributing to this. So in one sense, the higher faculties are perfect articulations of state functions, and they should be seen as such in Kant's view. And if they're functioning well, then they're helping the state function well. So there's a kind of symmetry there. Moreover, the higher faculties all have sort of textual authorities that they need in order for their faculty to function. So the faculty of theology, needs the Bible in order to function, and the Bible helps resolve various points of conflict within the faculty. The legal faculty needs a code of law, through which to educate jurists and lawyers, and through which to resolve various legal conflicts. And the medical faculty has state medical ordinances that it's sort of very much involved in helping to craft and keep up to date in terms of medical knowledge. Now, Kant describes people in these faculties as what he calls business people of learning, like a Schiffsleute, who train clergy, lawyers, doctors, etc. But because they're also in the university, they can also be scholars as well. And this idea of the scholar, which Kant also brings up, for example, in What is Enlightenment, is really central to his idea of the university that goes past it being a pure function or a pure sort of functionary of the state and its ends. And this is where the philosophy faculty comes in, the lower faculty. Kant says the philosophy faculty has no authoritative text. Rather, reason is sort of the authoritative figure in the philosophy faculty. It has no direct functional utility for the state, but rather, Kant writes, it could well happen that the last would be the first, and the lower faculty would assume a preeminent role, not in authority, but in counseling authority. So there's something about the critical function of the philosophy faculty that is purely devoted to reason that wouldn't tell lawyers, doctors, and clergy what to do, but rather would serve as a very useful counsel for authority in assuming these more direct purposes. And the reason he thinks that is because the philosophy faculty enforces what Kant, in What is Enlightenment, calls the distinction between public and private reason. Public reason is where scholars come together and discuss things of critical importance or discuss questions that are raised. And private reason is just individual conscience. This sort of correlates with the public sphere where things can be discussed, and private sense of duty that comes from what's demanded of you from the state. So for Kant, the philosophy faculty is really central because as a scholar, anyone in the higher faculty can submit to the authority of reason, can discuss things that they wouldn't be able to discuss otherwise when they're assuming this purely functional role in their own faculty. So Kant lays out this basic structure of the university, and then he says that the university is naturally going to produce certain conflicts. So conflicts might come into, or faculties might come into conflict with one another. For example, if someone is discussing the code of law using resources from history or literary studies for that matter, you would have a sort of conflict of who's the authority to speak about this. So conflicts can come from faculty sort of bringing different methodologies to texts that might be normally the provenance of one of the higher faculties. Now, these conflicts, Kant says, are legitimate when both sides approach them as scholars. So when both sides take up the questions that are being raised and try and resolve them just by virtue of reason and rational discussion, as opposed to trying to resolve them by, for example, authoritative texts or authoritative methodologies that are only authoritative within the restricted domain of a specific faculty. So, for example, when a legal faculty addresses claims that come from like the resources of historicization, and they resolve these through just appealing to the legal code, they are illegitimately resolving the conflict because they're not using resources that are available to both sides. So they're drawing the conflict on their side and resolving it on their side alone. And this Kant thinks is illegitimate. It's a version of resolving conflicts through force, deception, or dogmatism. And as we know just from Kant's general critical project and his full philosophical work, these are to be avoided, and rather the critical interrogation of first premises and the submission of those to reason are central not only to philosophy, but according to him, they're central to the state getting good counsel from the university. So Kant sort of derives a couple of suggestions from this. One, that the university legitimately plays some sort of mediating role between the state and society, whether it's through training leaders or, again, whether it's through preserving this atmosphere of scholarly dispute and discussion. And this is to say that he's making some sort of normative claim that the university should play this role, that it's legitimate for it to play this role. But he also, by pointing to the endemic sources of conflict in the university and pointing to legitimate ways in which they can be resolved, he has also a discussion about internal models of institutional reproduction, ways that faculties can relate to one another, ways that they can understand their sphere of authority, and ways that conflicts between those spheres of authority can be productively resolved in such a way that allows both the higher faculties to serve their functional role better and for the lower faculties to really assert reason and the kind of scholarly debate that one sees in the philosophical faculty as central to the university. So conflict is something that is to be embraced and not to be avoided in Kant's picture. So let me just finish up by trying to apply this way of thinking to a particular case. This comes from the University of Wisconsin here in the United States. This is an old picture of the University of Wisconsin at Madison, one of sort of our great public research universities like Berkeley or Michigan or UCLA. Now, Wisconsin was founded in the 19th century, like many of these universities, and it had something called the Wisconsin ideal that sort of set its ethos. And the idea was that, yes, higher learning and research was going to occur here, but the goods that were produced through this were going to be shared and distributed broadly throughout the state. So it wouldn't just be restricted to people in the university studying as some sort of private good they were accumulating, but rather it was always driven by this kind of public ethos. So here you can see a sort of version of Kant's view of the university that has the university assuming some sort of public role, speaking towards the broader functions of the state. Now, 5 or 6 years ago, the then governor of Wisconsin, sort of very right-wing figure, avatar of neoliberal reforms, the things that we were talking about before, tried to amend the mission statement of the state university to not talk about this dissemination of knowledge broadly beyond the walls of the campus, to not talk about it pursuing, research, training in a kind of public spirit. But he wanted to strike those words from the mission statement and describe the university simply in terms of meeting the state's workforce needs and having it serve its economic ends. Now, these proposals ultimately were rejected, but they caused an uproar in the state university system. People said, this can't be the way that you organize the university, simply around these ends. Many called for a return to the Wisconsin ideal as well. This means that we should, again, reassert this broad public spiritedness that has animated our university for a long time. So it's an attempt to sort of retreat from the restructuring of the state, the ideological ends that were pursued by the governor at the time, and say, well, the way we reject these is to reassert some sort of past ideal that was once very strong for us. But as I'm hoping to suggest in this argument, just reasserting an idea that comes from the history of the university might not be the most productive way to meet these kinds of challenges or to conceive of these kinds of challenges. Rather, if we think of the state as always being in this kind of dialogical and dialectical relationship between the ends of the state and the goods internal to scholarship and learning, then we might think of the university as serving an idea that is more historically attuned to what's going on in the present and more interested in both having a productive relationship to the state, but also in thinking about its own sort of internal reproduction of the goods that are central to it, which for Kant, and I'm suggesting as well, involves the critical work of the philosophy faculty. So what this means for Kant is that not only is this idea of institutional reproduction important, but also some sort of discourse ethics is implied for how to handle these kinds of conflicts. And retreating towards an ideal from the past or imposing some sort of managerial regime is not a productive way. And Kant provides, in my view, a more productive way to deal with conflict. Now, this pattern of thinking, I'm not new in thinking this way. Derrida wrote a lot on the conflict of the faculties and the centrality of philosophy to allow the state to function in a way that is more amenable to actually achieving its ends. And he was an early critic of the neoliberal model of the state that was emerging at the time. And Husserl also has a version of this just in the post-war period in the crisis of the European sciences. But to sort of summarize the argument, it's important, given that conflict is endemic at universities today, to not lose sight of the nature and purpose of the university, to not lose sight of the fact that it does have some sort of relationship to the state and can't just retreat into some sort of woolly humanistic ideal that maybe makes people feel better about what they're doing, but makes it less relevant in having some sort of relationship beyond the campus walls. But also to realize that these kinds of impositions, these managerial impositions, are part of the state reconstituting itself. They're part of an ideological reconstitution of the state. And the university actually is very well positioned both to clarify this and in some cases to resist it or to inject a critical spirit in sort of the Kantian vein, where we can take these conflicts as both illustrative and we can, in discussing them, with the spirit of the philosophical faculty in mind, in a way that can, help sort of reconstruct certain ideals that are both central to the university, but also might be central to the reconstruction of the state as well. I apologize for, again, presenting by a pool and I rushed through that. It's a more complex argument I'd be happy to talk about more, but hopefully you have a sense of it, and we can talk about it more in discussion. But I think now I'll stop my part of the presentation and hand things over to Julie, who's also going to talk about conflict as being endemic and potentially productive, but she's going to talk about it more in terms of learning processes as opposed to higher education. So let me stop my share and mute, and I'll turn it over to Julie now.
Hello. So if there are no questions, we can proceed to my presentation. I'll share my screen. So I mostly want to talk about stress in learning. There's kind of conflict related to this in education. So my problem is, and my problem as well, is that we are philosophers, but also I have some background in psychology and some background in neurobiology, and I'm trying to analyze pedagogy through those perspectives. And I really like philosophy more because philosophy is less positively oriented than it's more deep analysis of education and of life. And I deal mainly with negative effects in life, such as anxiety and depression and stress. And within this project that we are involved with Mike, I'm dealing with education, with students, so concept of idea of a stress analyzed through perspective of philosophy and psychology as applied to students and to education. And the problem is that within psychology and within psychiatry, and those are discourses that dominate our everyday life and our everyday language. Wherever we talk about ourselves, we're trying to analyze ourselves. We would, for the most chance, talk about ourselves in psychological definitions and through the lens of psychological problems. This is how we currently perceive ourselves, through the precisely popular psychology, since this discourse is the one that is that dominates today. And because of this, anxiety and stress are perceived as some deviations, as some kind of some kind of a disorder that has to be treated, which implies that the ideal human being of the way we perceive it in everyday life and the way we perceive it through the lens of psychology is the one who doesn't have anxiety and stress, is probably happy and calm. So whenever we talk about anxiety and stress, we tend to perceive them as disorder. Since what comes to mind is generalized anxiety disorder, like you want to add word disorder to it, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So stress is not good. It's some kind, it's perceived that way. It's some kind of a disorder, something that has to be fixed or avoided. But within philosophy, it's totally different story, even the opposite story, especially in existential philosophy, because while in psychology, anxiety is deviation from normality, something we have to avoid to preserve the normality, for it to remain not deviated. In philosophy, it's totally opposite, the perception of what is anxiety. For example, for Kierkegaard, the one who started to talk about anxiety, or his word for it was angst, or fear, existential fear. He started to talk about it as the heart of normality. So philosophy much better captures the tragedy of human existence, which psychology doesn't capture at all. There is no tragedy of human existence. Wherever psychology is talking about tragedy, it's only talking in the context of how to fix it or how to get rid of it, nothing else. It's never see the tragedy on its own terms. It's not capable of it. It's only through the utility and bringing human to the healthy state, which is deprived of anxiety and all those things, negative effects. In philosophy, it's different. For Kierkegaard, angst, this anxiety, existential anxiety, is the heart of normality, meaning that whatever we consider as normal is just the deviation or our adaptation to the basic anxiety that humans feel. And this is the tragedy of human being. We do have this at the basis of whatever looks normal, or wherever might look as our adaptation, as our way to survive, is just the deviation of existential basic anxiety. And for Heidegger as well, Heidegger develops Kierkegaard's ideas, and he claims that angst is Grundstimmung. This is the basic mood of human. You can't escape anxiety, this existential anxiety. It's always there. It might be sleeping, but there's always a chance that you might slip into anxiety. There is always the background from which we have to kind of deviate to in order to survive, in order to live properly. And of course, we can say that Heidegger's understanding of anxiety as existential anxiety is different from our everyday types of anxieties, but it's not that different, because if you think about it, any depression, any negative effect that we feel in our ordinary everyday lives, for example, anxiety of a breakup, it is still existential, because the ordinary breakup can be seen as the world changed for you, and you revealed something about this world, right? Someone who was close to you, someone who was close to you is not close to you anymore. So it's radically changed, and who knows what else can change. So it's not every anxiety has this existential part to it, maybe on a deeper level, but all everyday anxieties, they point towards this basic existential anxiety. And my favorite philosopher, Zapffe, he's the one who defines anxiety and depression as actually the biologically. He's my favorite for one of the reasons, because he is the one who more or less is possible to combine with empirical research and with empirical uses language of biology, even though he's philosopher. So according to him, his idea is that we feel this anxiety and we will never get rid of it because it's just in part of our nature. But our nature is there is this mistake in our nature because our consciousness or intellect is overly evolved. We are we supposed to feel the anxiety, and he doesn't imply the perspective that we can change our nature. Something can be changed since we are the result of this mistake, and we will disappear once this mistake will be corrected. This is actually his idea, that maybe it's not such a bad thing just to disappear, since it's so hard for us to survive. And also Zappa is extremely tragical in this because according to him, if you extend his thinking, it will turn out that the more we progress in our intellectual development, and this is what all of us, what we want probably, the more anxiety we'll feel and the more unbearable the life is going to be. So it's philosophy here and psychology here kind of pointing towards different directions. Precisely, psychology is pointing towards direction with the happy ending, and philosophy just doesn't point, just claims that it's quite tragic to go deeper in thinking about who we are. And for Heidegger, so there are different understanding of anxiety within the our everyday language, which is psychological or dominated by psychology, and philosophical language, which probably by definition can be the everyday language, or maybe it can. So for Heidegger, he even claims that we all know probably that there are two modes of existence: inauthentic, that is the bad one, and authentic. This is the one we have to, ideally, all of us have to live that way. So inauthentic is the way of life where we don't have critical attitude, when we're just immersed in the ways of the world. We are distracted from this Grundstimmung, the basic mood of anxiety, and completely distracted by the world. We just do our work, we do what we are told, and we just don't think about it, don't go deeper, and don't critically analyze anything. And authentic, as opposite, for authentic mode of thinking, the crucial role here plays anxiety, because this is the feeling when you the feelings through which you kind of switch from inauthentic way of being to authentic way of being. This is because when you feel an anxiety, the world that is known to you, as it is known to you, your native world, it start to be the foreign one, and you reveal the the other side of it. So it's you analyze something critically, and it start to be for you something different that you got used to, and the way start to be seen by you in different light than it was seen before, and it's unfriendly, it's foreign. And through this feeling of anxiety, this switch happens, that you actually, this challenges the secure foundation of your existence. And anxiety raises awareness of the fundamental uncertainty of the world, and of the world that now start to be foreign for you. It's not comfortable anymore. And through this, subject gets their independence and their critical thinking. So all the things that we ideally want to see in human, especially in students, it comes necessary, according to Heidegger, with an anxiety. And anxiety feel so not only Grundstimmung, that is a characteristic of a human being as such, but also it's important to within the switch from inauthentic way of being to authentic way of being. And accordingly, if we think about the ideal human, the way it is seen in everyday language dominated by psychology, that would be a healthy, happy, and successful individual. This is more or less our everyday understanding what we have to become. But for philosophy, it's different. It's hard to define what kind of the ideal human, and if there is any ideal human for philosophy. But probably something that unites philosophers, not all of them. It's just that it's supposed to be a thinking person, the one who is involved in thinking, even though it implies being not unhappy and not being successful and have troubles adapting to the world. It's doesn't matter for philosophy, actually. But for psychology, it's this is the aim. So they are different. And if you try to think what is the ideal student, what is the difference? Because pedagogy is dominated, I have a feeling at least, that is dominated by psychological discourse. And if we and therapeutic discourse, students are kind of, and all of us are seen as patients that need to become, and teachers and professors need to work on them to be happy and learn well and later be successful in life, to learn more. But for philosophy, it's much harder to define what would be the ideal of a student. And for example, Ronald Barnett, he tries to think about education and being a student in the existential framework, and therefore he comes to the conclusion that being a student is to be in a state of anxiety. Since students, he exploits this idea, Heideggerian idea of switch between the inauthentic and authentic way of being, and therefore, because student is demanded to have critical thinking, to become independent, to become adult and separated from the ways of the world, and not to feel too comfortable and to think for themselves. So this implies that they are in a constant state of anxiety. And this perspective obviously contradicts the perspective of psychology and perspective of the way we normally see what does it mean to be a student, and what we want the student to the perfect student to be. And also, for example, this is dominant perspective. The opposite perspective is dominant. For example, Alistair Smith claims he is an influential teaching consultant in UK. He claims that the enemy of learning is stress, and the optimal conditions for learning include positive personal learning attitude, and where challenge is high and anxiety and self-doubt is low. Well, according to Heidegger, of course, this would be totally wrong, because this implies this happy ideal of psychological ideal of a student who doesn't worry, has no stress, no anxiety. And the problem with this attitude that more or less all of us know about is that it implies this ideal of a healthy student, psychologically healthy student, as the one, and psychologically healthy teacher as those who don't feel anxiety and stress at all. And my problem with it, one of the problems, is that it causes even greater stress, because this ideal itself it causes even greater stress, because when you worry, when you stress, and plus to that you understand that you don't coincide, you're not healthy, and you think that there are some healthy people who don't feel that way, and there's something wrong with you. You feel your stress, so you start to worry about your stress, have the stress about your stress, and this makes you feel even worse than you feel. It's just one of the problems. So, but within biology and within neuroscience, there are actually many Heideggerian. So it starts to be quite Heideggerian, or it starts to be compatible with Heideggerian existential way of thinking on a level of empirical research. Because for Hans Selye, this is the father of stress. He invented the concept and developed the concept of stress. So according to him, the way he perceived it initially, it was different from the way we perceive it now, that stress is something we have to avoid, and it's only a reaction on something bad, on some kind of threat. For him, it's just universal, non-specific, adaptive reaction to something novel. It's not necessarily bad or good, doesn't matter. It's non-specific, and it's adaptive, so it has a role. If you we can't avoid it, because since it is a part of adaptation. It's not a part of the adaptation, but it is adaptation itself. This is how our body adapts to the new situation, and he has a great example to show that it is non-specific. For example, if mother is informed that her son died during the war, she will feel stress, right? Because this is new life situation and this is a great loss. So she will have to adapt to this new situation, but on account to this bad news, and to kind of try to survive. But on the contrary, if she will be informed that this information was wrong and her son is still alive, or she will see her son, and she'll be happy, obviously, but she'll still feel stress, maybe the stress for a larger level, since this information is still considered in the context of bad information, of bad news. Is new for her. She needs to adapt to this good news. So stress is non-specific, and even more than that, in a similar way, like Kierkegaard perceived anxiety as the well, Kierkegaard and Heidegger perceived anxiety as the something basic that we can never avoid. We can just maybe to survive, we can deviate from it, or we can learn to live with it or do something with it, but we can never get rid of it completely, because this is who we are. So same for Syria. He claimed that we can only avoid stress when we're dead, since the difference as far as we're alive, there is only a difference in the level of stress, which corresponds to a level of novelty, and nothing else. Not necessary, not whether we evaluate some changes that we have to adapt, some situation that we have to adapt as bad or good. It's just a matter of novelty. So even when we sleep, we feel stress, some level of stress, since our heart beats, something happening in the body, and this process is over maybe just lower level of stress than when we are awake and when we are exposed to some radically life-changing news. So this was initial interpretation of Syria, who never implied that we can get rid of stress and that stress is necessary, something bad. It's something that we won't survive without, since it's involved, it is adaptation. And adaptation can be interpreted as learning. And the way stress and learning are seen, how they correspond to each other. And stress is related to learning precisely because from the psychological manifestation of stress, so the whole body is involved in a reaction of stress in all its levels, but from the psychological side, and its psychological manifestation are the most important for its connection with learning. So in the psychological manifestation are normally defined as anxiety, and those are connected, the increased attention and focus, and also activation of memory. So when we are stressed, we feel anxious, and we have increased attention because we need to concentrate to solve the problem, to adapt, and we need to focus on a certain problem, or our body is focusing on a certain problem, trying to adapt to it. And from psychological level, our memory is activated, since we need to learn to get more information to be able to adapt better. So all of those are interconnected, and this is how it connects with stress connects with learning. Since one of the ways to demonstrate it is that during the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, people have symptoms of too vivid memories. When something that traumatizes us happened, for example, war or battle, the soldiers might have the too vivid memory of traumatizing events. They might have flashbacks. They even want to forget something, but they just can't, because their adaptation, their stress work in that way that they remember it vividly. So they might have nightmares, the flashbacks, and even they want to forget it, they can't. And this is a part of the process of adaptation. Their body was trying to adapt to the situation. Just it's very hard to adapt to the situation, maybe even impossible, and because of the situation is very hard to adapt to, not because there's something wrong with them. Well, and it would be maybe a more not bad adaptation, but they normally have it once they are not on a battlefield anymore. So for battlefield, the adaptation that work in a certain context doesn't work in a peaceful life context. So their adaptation doesn't work within the peaceful circumstances of life. So it was adaptation and it was learning. And even though it might be in an exaggerated way, we consider it as a mental disorder, right? So, and now it is actually recognized within neuroscience that neurotransmitters and hormones that are responsible that are involved in stress events, stress reaction on stress, are the main modulators of human learning. So stressful reaction is learning. We can't get rid of stress and learn without stress, because learning is the way of adaptation. And of course, students will be more anxious, since they need to learn a lot of new things, and they are constantly exposed to new circumstances, life circumstances, becoming adults, and exposed to new information and new kind of responsibilities. So it is most existentially anxious time of lifetime. So neuroscience, even though we saw with Alistair Smith this tendency that stress is bad for learning, and even though we need to get rid of it, and there are people who might promise you that they will, for money mostly, that they will help you to get rid from stress in like 1 week or something like that, or that propagating the idea that student might be totally healthy students should never feel stressed, or that you might never feel stressed. And this might be the current popular idea, but in neuroscience there are quite Heideggerian tendencies. Neuroscientists mostly don't know about it. Those who deal with learning and stress, they don't know they're Heideggerian, but one of the goals of our research project, is to connect neuroscience and philosophy, those tendencies that are actually easy to connect. Because since for Celia and for Heidegger and for neuroscientific empirical research, those explanations are similar, and they are quite tragical, the way I like it, that we can never avoid the stress, and so we can only work with it, and learning and life are quite tragical by themselves. So without this promise of a happy ending that psychology normally promises, and sometimes hiding economic utility purposes behind it. So to what this healthy individual and healthy successful student, except for it's not ideal in itself, right? It's always the idea behind it. There's always the utility of someone who is more economically successful and useful for society in that way. It's not actually taking care of students as such. It's just something, so some other ideology is at work here. So considering this research, this empirical research, and this perspective of learning, the greatest advice was given by Kierkegaard, who just claimed that he, and I would add she as well, therefore, who has learned rightly to be anxious, has learned the most important thing. So probably the next stage of development of the research, connected research in neuroscience and in pedagogy, is that the more tragical one, that there is nothing we can do about our tragical existence. And we might call it stress management, even though I don't like this word. It implies that the feeling that we can manage it and totally control it, but we can't. But to learn it, and to learn it deeper, and to get involved in a more deeper understanding of what is happening, this we can do, even if we won't, if the consequences and the result of our thinking and our research won't lead toward the happy ending and understanding of humans as such that will be happy one day. Yeah, that's all. I'm happy to answer your questions.